So we do a lot of programming with kids. We have summer camps where kids can come do different pollinator related activities or like school field trips. And then all the way up to, like I mentioned, if you're an adult who maybe is interested in doing a pollinator garden where you live or just learning more about pollinators.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Pollinating insects have become a feature in many public spaces in urban areas. I was recently, for example, at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Oslo, Norway, and I was astounded by the level of public education built into the gardens around pollinators. Now, I've long known that Minnesota has been at the leading edge of doing just this thing in the U.S., so I was excited when one of our former guests, Rick Sherman, told me about the Bee and Pollinator Discovery Center, which is situated in the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. This week, I'm joined by the person that Rick met. Ping Honzay has been the educator and beekeeper at the center since 2016. I wanted to find out from her how the center works and what kind of programming is really well suited to that kind of setting. So without further ado, let's head out to the land of lakes this week on Pollination. Well, welcome to Pollination.
All right. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to chat more about pollinators.
I am too. Especially with arboretums. When I think about an arboretum, I think about trees, and of course there are all sorts of great trees for pollinators, but a kind of collection of trees, some conifers, something from maybe a geographically situated arboretum. The University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum is a little bit different. It's not just a set of curated trees. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how the pollinator program sort of, is part of the whole picture of the Arboretum?
Yeah, so the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum is part of the University of Minnesota, and it's about 1,200 acres. So it's a really big piece of land, and we have about 500,000 visitors every year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so a big part of what we do is, we serve as a collection for plants, and we have a lot of active research programs. So we like to boast that we're the home of the Honeycrisp. It's where the Honeycrisp apple was invented.
Oh.
And we have this.
Sorry, I have to say we're in horticulture here, and we always look at the Minnesota web page as like the model. We just can we have a page like that with all the apple varieties? Anyways, so yes, you've got there's all of that going on as well, all the horticulture programs, and they're feeding into the Arboretum. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, it's very exciting. Like I said, we love to talk that part up. So we have all these research programs going on, but we also are a big place just for visitors to come, connect with nature and to learn. And we are really lucky at the University of Minnesota to have, these really amazing bee research programs. So on campus, we have a honeybee lab and a native bee lab that are doing a lot of really amazing work. And as you know, there's been a lot of excitement around pollinators and bees within the past, few decades. And we had some people at the Arboretum who were really excited about having a place at the Arboretum where we could do outreach and education around the research work that's happening on campus at the university. So leading up to 2016, we had some donors who got really excited about this and donated to create this building at the Arboretum that's all about bees and pollinators and really doing education around them, which is pretty special. A lot of places maybe have some programming around them, but this building is just dedicated to bees and pollinators.
It just strikes me that Minnesota is, really the shining star of a lot of pollinator programming in the U.S. The two bee labs, the native bee lab and the honeybee lab, are world renowned. But also just the programming that has happened with monarch butterflies and rusty patch bumblebee and the state's investment in those. And here, an example of how actual private businesses are also investing. It's a really wonderful story for all of this kind of focus on pollinators. And now learning that this has come into the Arboretum as well. So that's part of it. So in 2016, all of these resources sort of come together and there's this investment. Can you just tell us a little bit about how, you talked a little about some of the buildings, and tell us, what is it like if a visitor is to come to the Arboretum? How would they recognize that there's a pollinator focus going on?
Yeah, so the Bee Center is part of this kind of newer area at the Arboretum. So I mentioned it's about 1,200 acres, so it's pretty large. We're kind of away from the main visitor centers, but we have this area called the Farm at the Arboretum. That the vision for that area is that it's to really tell the like plant to plate story for visitors. Like where does our food come from? How do we grow it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the Bee Center was the first building open as part of that, of course, to help tell that pollination story, which is really exciting to have that piece of it as well. So when you come into the farm, we have examples of like crop plots, so kind of like what does larger scale agriculture look like, as well as smaller scale. So we have like vegetable gardens, kind of more like home scale or like homegrown scale of food production. And then all around the pollinator center are pollinator friendly plants specifically. So it's a place where, gardeners can also come and see some examples of like, if I want to plant for pollinators in my yard, what could that look like? Or what are some plants? That's a big focus we have a garden called the Foodscape that's supposed to be kind of a demonstration of what, growing plants, edible plants in your home landscape can look like. And a big area of that is called the Meadow for Sharing. So it's like plants that can feed you, but also feed pollinators, or how you can kind of interplant those together. So really trying to tell that like, food for people, food for pollinators story, like how does that all work together? Because it's a pretty complex system, right? But all of those pieces can fit together.
What I'm envisioning is plots, cultivated plots with a row of squashes and melons and other things. And then is the pollinator component kind of woven in, or is it kind of, on the, kind of on the headlands of this vegetable? Describe how these two things come together again. I heard you kind of hint in that direction, but a little bit more.
Yeah, so directly around the Bee and Pollinator Center, it's just sort of focused on pollinator plants. But then we have an area that has a lot of different fruit plants, and that those fruit plants are interplanted, pollinator-friendly plants, again, to try to tell that story of like, so you have your apple trees or your, different fruit plants. If you want them to be pollinated, here are some other plants you can plant among those plants to attract pollinators. And then in the kind of like Meadow for Sharing is what we call it, with near the foodscape where all the vegetables are, there's a lot of like pollinator friendly plants that kind of echo the plants by the pollinator center.
So kind of like literally a meadow adjacent to where the vegetables and fruits are being produced, with pollinator plants, so you can see them side by side.
Yeah, exactly.
I imagine for most people, this raises all sorts of questions of like, how can I do this at home? That must be a key that just immediately pops to mind.
Yeah, and that's a big part of what we are hoping to do with these different gardens, is to be a demonstration for visitors. Like, this is what it could look like where you are, because all of these gardens are, they're not huge. So it's like, if you have a little bit of land, you could do something like this. And that's a big piece of some of the things that we try to do in our classes. So we have we just had a bee lawn class, okay, so if you want to plant a bee lawn where you live, here's how you can do that. Or, some of our different other types of classes that we have, if you want to plant for pollinators, here's how you can do that. And then we can just walk right outside and see. You can have the classroom part and then just walk right outside and see, this is what that looks like.
Well, this raises the question. This raises the whole question, what the programs are like. So you've hinted at them. So the bee lawn, which I want to hear more about. Tell us a little bit more about the breadth of programming that is available for somebody who comes and wants to pick up these skills.
Of course. So we're really lucky at the Arboretum, and of course at the University of Minnesota in general, where we have a lot of resources. Like I mentioned, the bee labs and the research coming out of there. They also do some education. Specifically with the bee lab, we also have extension educators who work at the Arboretum who are able to do classes. So we have a wide range of offerings for everywhere from, like preschool age to adults to come out and learn about pollinators, depending on what their interest level is and maybe current experience level. So we do a lot of programming with kids. We have summer camps where kids can come do different pollinator related activities or like school field trips. And then all the way up to, like I mentioned, if you're an adult who maybe is interested in doing a pollinator garden where you live or just learning more about pollinators. So kind of a wide range of age offerings. And a lot of our offerings or educational programs, do sort of cater more to someone who is maybe just getting started or just learning about pollinators, which I think is a really exciting place to be because we get to be in that place of maybe like sparking excitement for someone, especially for kids. I work with kids a lot, actually. And it's really exciting to, go out to a honeybee hive. So we have programs where they can come put on a suit and go out and look inside a hive, and to have that just initial like, oh, this is really exciting, I want to learn more about this. Or going out in the garden with kids and, finding bees and being like, oh, now you can take a closer look where you live because now you've seen this here, and that's just right in your backyard too, right? It's not anything special. It's just something that you can go find now that you've kind of learned to look a little bit closer.
It's nice, I imagine, to have everything kind of combined. You have the apiculture there, and you can do all sorts of, indoor activities like processing hive products. But you have as you said, you have the pollinator lawn, you have these meadowscapes, you have other plantings, so that for an educator, you just have everything at your fingertips. So you can kind of like, I can just imagine you have the capacity to sort of, well, next year I'm going to change this. You're not always moving around and you kind of, I need to plant some of this because when I was explaining this concept, I didn't quite have all the breadth of flowers or something in place.
Yeah, that's totally right. I sometimes forget how lucky we are at our facility to have all those things, and then we get other people coming in like, oh, this is really great. And like you mentioned, we have the honeybee hives that are behind like full length glass windows, so we can just do demonstrations.
Okay.
But yeah, we try to emphasize a lot, like the native bee piece as well, or planting for pollinators. And we have those gardens just right there that we can just step outside and look at. Or like you said, maybe we decide like, oh, next year. So we're actually in the process of like redoing our bee lawn by the bee center. So there definitely are things that we're like, oh, that didn't work quite how we wanted last year. So we'll redo it. But it's not like reinventing the wheel every year. It's kind of like just iterating and improving on things as we see them. And we do have this facility where we can do a lot of things inside. So we do our honey harvest as a public demonstration every year, and we have classes where we work with beeswax products. So
So you've been hard at work at this since 2016, and I already can hear you talking about things that have worked and things that need to be. Jake, can you give us some examples I know there's a lot of educators who listen to this show. In fact, the way that we are connected is through Rick Sherman, who's going to be on a podcast coming up. Rick is part of the Farm to School program here in Oregon, who came to the Arboretum and was so inspired with the programming there. Can you, for those educators who are listening, can you give us some sense of things that, have not worked well, things that have really worked well? What are some lessons learned after kind of developing programming for such a wide range of the public?
Yeah. I mean, I know some of this might seem obvious, but really, the more hands-on you can make it, the better. So I mentioned, getting out to see the hives or, going out in the garden to find bees. There's just nothing quite like that. For kids and adults, really, we get to work with, like I mentioned, all ages, and just to have that, like, oh, I'm seeing this right in front of me and experiencing that on, all these different sensory levels. And we do a variety of different types of hands-on programming. So like I mentioned, with planting things, being able to go out and see the garden as well, or engaging different senses. I do really love doing honey tastings. And again, that works for all ages. And you can talk about, again, some of the plant pieces as well. Like, where does this come from? Why are these honeys different? And bring in all of those. I think one area that we have done a lot of tweaking with is like, what does maybe winter educational programming look like?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, especially in Minnesota. And I think, winter's a really great time to do some of those things I mentioned, like doing, what does it look like when we process products from the hive? So we do different like beekeeping craft classes, and those are really exciting in the winter. But I think in general, it can be, tricky to get some of those hands-on pieces just don't quite work as well. And so winter's maybe just a time where you can offer different types of things, but also do a lot of, your planning and admin. So I don't know if I have anything really amazingly insightful to say about that.
No, that's a really good point, and it maybe it is a matter of taking those opportunities as they come along. That there are parts of the season when you really can connect people to, as you said, the most impactful kind of connection is when somebody's a few inches from a bee on an echinacea flower, and they're slowly working on the florets and the little disc flowers, and you can really get up close and observe this. It's something, and I imagine that's always kind of so impactful because they probably have missed this in their everyday life. They haven't noticed, and so suddenly you've given them this vision that they can take around in their life. But you know maximizing those periods, and then there are periods when there's just not a lot going on, and you can try to put the square peg in the round hole, but it might not be worth the effort. That's great
I
advice.
guess, okay. I guess another thing too, so we do get a lot of people who come in and have questions about what they can do to help, or they're, of course, are like, oh, I've heard a lot about how bees are in trouble, and like wanting to know more about that. And I really try to keep our messaging positive around that. I think, wanting to be realistic that, there's definitely things that we see that concern us. But I think when you are able to like maybe end on a hopeful note, that kind of creates more of a call to action for people, as opposed to just like sort of a doom and gloom, like, well, there's nothing we can do, because the great thing is that it is an issue where people can actually do things. It's not like something that's happening really far away. It's happening in their backyard, where, they can plant things, or they can change how they manage their gardens, or even, talk to their local lawmakers to create positive change, and to try to talk about those pieces of it more than the, like, oh, everything's terrible kind of messaging, I think is more useful.
And I imagine it lends itself to that, just the bee lawn, and being able to see that you can perhaps have a lawn that doesn't require that much maintenance, that can have bees on them, and if their lawn is looking a little long in the tooth, they can this is an option that they can do at home. Like, it must just lend itself to my fruit trees, I just have turf right up to the bark, and if I could just open it up and put a few forbs at the base. I imagine that people's brains just are just spinning with ideas after they leave. You must have people who are I'm going to do this when I go home.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's really great too, because I had a parent I still remember from a field trip once, who said like, oh, now I feel really guilty for like pulling out all of these plants in my yard. And, not wanting to like shame people or be like, yes, you should feel guilty, but like, being able to show them like, oh, look how beautiful this landscape can look if you, plant these things also for pollinators, and you can interplant them with other plants that you want, and just like an exciting demonstration of, oh, this is what that can look like.
I think personally, I think like the thing that you said earlier, that people really need an experiential. They need to see the bee, and they need to see the flowers and see how it's arranged. But I do find in the education I do in Oregon, people just don't know how to do it. And when there's just like you see like you say, the finished product is there, it looks nice. You tell them that it wasn't water intensive or labor intensive. This could be yours as well. That's really exciting. I mean, you really walk away with plant, and maybe that's what they can do in the winter. Is that's what I do in the winter. Is I
Right. Just some
scheme about what
planning.
I'm going to buy to put in my garden next year.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. This is a really unique outreach program, I think, nationally, and I'm glad that we were able to spend a few minutes just catching up and learning about it. I'm sure there's people at arboretums around the nation that this is, including here at Oregon State University, we just became an arboretum, a campus arboretum. This is going to be really inspiring. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really great chatting. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.